I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Good evening, Richard. Welcome back to another episode of our podcast.
Evening, Glenn.
How are you tonight?
Little under the weather, but I am here.
I'm really excited for tonight's episode, Richard. There's a topic that's really, really close to my heart. We're going to be talking about the integration of Buddhism and psychotherapy. For listeners that don't know, I suppose I'm a Buddhist. And we'll talk about that because there's that's kind of a nuanced thing. We're going to talk about how maybe in some ways it's problematic to say I'm a Buddhist, even if you are. But I'd say I'm a Buddhist. I have a long history with Buddhism. I started studying Buddhism as a teenager and through my 20s. And Buddhism is actually something very near and dear to my heart. I'm also a therapist, as are you, Richard. And Buddhism is something that's sort of penetrated the world of psychotherapy. Buddhism is a very popular topic in psychotherapy. A great deal of information and the kind of philosophy of Buddhism has penetrated the world of psychotherapy. And while this has been going on for about 50 or 60 years, and we'll look at the history of that tonight, in the past 10 or 15, I'd say that the pace has really increased and that Buddhism is, I would say, even popular. That a lot of the therapists that I encounter are incorporating some dimension, some aspect of Buddhism into their practice. Mindfulness meditation is absolutely everywhere in the therapy room and out of it. And so we're going to be talking about that tonight. We're going to be talking about what it means for Buddhism to enter the world of psychotherapy and, how that process of integration is going. We're going to look critically at the integration of Buddhism into psychotherapy, whether or not it's possible, its problems and pitfalls, and also its opportunities and its merits. So yeah, that's going to be the focus of our discussion tonight. So Richard, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to jump right into explaining to our listeners as much as I can about Buddhism to bring people up to speed. And then we can talk a little bit more after that about some of the ways in which Buddhism is maybe brought into our world of contemporary psychotherapy. How does that sound?
I'm excited. I think that's a great start.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to start by telling the story of the Buddha, because I think that that's the best way to learn about Buddhism. The Buddha was a historical figure. He probably lived somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 years ago. And there's sort of records detailing his life. And he's kind of an interesting figure. So he lived in a sort of a region that sort of borders India, Nepal, like northern India, the lower Himalayas. And he was born into a royal family. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, but the Zen Buddhists like to call him Shakyamuni, which is sort of leader of the Shakya clan. And that was his family lineage, was the Shakya clan of that region. But he was born to kind of a father that was in a royal position. And his mother died, I think either at childbirth or relatively early in his life. So he didn't really know his mother, but he was raised by his father and other family members. And one of the tellings of the story of the Buddha is that there was a sage that his father consulted, and the sage sort of gave a prophecy that the Buddha would himself become a great sage, a great spiritual figure, and go on to, do amazing things in sort of the spiritual realm. The Buddha's father didn't like that. He didn't like that his son was going to, become a mendicant or become a religious or spiritual person. He had aspirations for his son as a sort of royal figure and an authority figure to kind of inherit his position eventually as leader of the Shakya clan and sort of his important position. And so what the Buddha's father did is he sort of ordained to keep his son away from anything that might kind of light a spiritual spark inside of him, right? So he was kind of confined to the castle, the palace in which he lived. And he was really just tended to very, very well. He sort of knew no suffering, right? He had all of his needs tended to. He had servants that waited on him. He ate well, he slept, and he was, sort of raised in his culture and raised to the position that his father hoped that he would eventually grow into. But the Buddha was dissatisfied with this. He didn't like something about this. I think probably like any of us would have. He felt that there was something wrong about his upbringing. I think he felt stifled. He felt too confined. He felt restricted or smothered. And like any rebellious teenager, eventually the Buddha found a way around, his father's authority and his father's limitations of him. And he went out to explore the city one day. He snuck out. And this is an important component of the story of the Buddha, because in a lot of tellings of the Buddha, there are a few things that he encountered while he was out, in the city with the common people. And the things that he encountered would go on to inform and his kind of position on things. And also it was the match that lit the spiritual fire within him. So he was said to encounter, I believe it was like an impoverished person, an ill person, a dead body, and then also like an ascetic, like a spiritual practitioner of the time. At the time, obviously in India, Buddhism wasn't a thing, but there were kind of known and understood spiritual disciplines. Vedanta is the name of one of them. There were ascetic disciplines. There was sort of a foundation of spirituality, which the Buddha would, essentially kind of work off of in his time. But yeah, he encountered these four things. So he saw like a poor person begging. He saw like an ill person, who was kind of decrepit and deformed by their illness. He saw a dead body, and he saw an ascetic man meditating. And this really impacted him to see these things. He'd never seen these things before in his life, because he was so sheltered. And so he went back to the palace, and he was sort of forever changed. He sort of knew that, something about the life that he was leading was problematic, that there was a whole world out there for him to discover. He had a real fire lit in him. And so he fled. He fled the clutches of his father, and he went off into the woods, and he was drawn towards spiritual life. And so, as I made reference to, there was already a kind of established spirituality in the region at the time. It's sort of Vedanta. He took on the role of what was called a samana, which was kind of the name of an ascetic spiritual practitioner. And that was the real focus in the area, was asceticism. And so when I say asceticism, I mean a real denial of, sort of the sense pleasures, someone who really lives a very, very simple, kind of impoverished life. The assumption being that if I sort of deny these base sensory pleasures, these, my hunger, my sexual instinct, my need for, social or professional gratification, that I can devote more of my energy to spiritual pursuits and to spiritual enlightenment. And so the Buddha did just that. He devoted himself intensely to the practice of asceticism. And a big part of that was fasting, was not eating for lengthy periods of time, was eating as little as possible. And so he lived a very simple life. And he did this for years, living in the woods. And it was awful. It nearly killed him. This is, kind of embedded in the story, is that it was very, very difficult for him to sustain. He lost a lot of weight. He was very malnourished. He was dying, essentially. And there was sort of a moment in his practice where he sort of went, is this it? Like, is this the way? And he was really, kind of in a dire place, and sort of really questioned, oh my God, like, what am I doing? And decided to make a change, decided to leave behind asceticism. And he embraced more of a moderate position. So he started eating. He started sort of practicing less. He sort of focused on nourishing himself more. Some people call this the middle way, which is an essential component of Buddhist philosophy. And so he started living a more moderate lifestyle. He did not go back to the extreme indulgence that, he might have known as a child, but he certainly did not starve himself. And so it's said that, he did this for some time and continued to devote himself to spiritual practice, but in a more moderate sense and kind of differently. And that eventually, somewhere in the region, under what's called the Bodhi tree, which is a famous tree. I don't think that the Bodhi tree itself still stands, but I believe that an ancestor of the tree is still planted somewhere in the region of his enlightenment. But it's said that, it was very early in the morning. He was meditating, and he opened up his eyes, and he looked up into the sky, and he saw the morning star, and he was suddenly awakened. He was suddenly awakened to his true nature. He experienced nirvana, and nirvana here is a Sanskrit word, which would mean enlightenment. Actually, the more concrete definition of this is the snuffing out of a flame. So it's interesting that the concept of enlightenment has connotations of actually light going out. And again, we'll talk about that. But he experienced a kind of enlightenment. He came to some spiritual truth in himself. And the experience was transformative. And so after this experience, he would go on to bring something of this back to the people of the world. He would go on to share something of his experience and what he learned. And this would eventually be sort of canonized into the teachings of the Buddha and then into the more kind of organized forms of Buddhist religion. And so one of the first teachings that the Buddhists gave, and I think this is what the sort of the basis or the core of what Buddhism is about, is the Buddha was really just trying to, he felt he had discovered, or he felt he had experienced the end of suffering, and that what he was focused on, what he was interested in communicating to people was suffering and how to end its suffering. And so the first teaching that he provided was the Four Noble Truths. And so he sort of laid out his teaching in four discrete statements, my layperson translation of which is something like, life is suffering. Okay, so that was sort of the first thing that he said. The Sanskrit word that was used was called dukkha. And dukkha can roughly be translated into suffering. It might also be better translated into something like dissatisfaction or angst. There's sort of a sense of life never being enough, life not ever giving us a full satisfaction, right? Never really being able to find happiness, always kind of suffering, always having some quality of not quite rightness, you might say. And then he went on to say that this dukkha, this suffering, is caused by attachment, desire, identification. The word that he used was tanha, which again can be kind of translated into like craving, attachment, desire, identification. So he had some sense that our dukkha, our suffering, our angst, is caused by a sort of sense and desire of us, an attachment, a craving for more, a feeling that we don't have enough, and the desire to pursue it and to find some conditions that provide perfect happiness for us. And then he went on to say that suffering can come to an end. There is an end to suffering. There can be an end to suffering. And that the way to the end of suffering is to follow the path of the Buddha, which is described as the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is sort of an orthodox conventional way of looking at the prescriptive teachings of the Buddha. So the Buddha gave a series of teachings to people, to lay people specifically, that kind of described a way of living that was sort of consistent with his position and with this idea of how to end suffering. So he talked about 8 different kind of domains of focus: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And it was said that if one follows, these prescriptions, that one can attain nirvana, just like the Buddha did, the snuffing out of the flame of suffering. So, Richard, I'll check in with you. I've shared a lot. Is this all making sense so far? Are you following me?
It is so far. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Should I keep going?
Yeah, I think you've provided a good background on the history of the Buddha, how he kind of became to be, and you're now providing some fundamental definitions. I'm hearing tanha, I'm hearing, which is this craving, dukkha, which is suffering. And yeah, I'm really curious about how these all work together and the impact on psychology, I guess. So I'm just waiting on bated breath.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Okay, let's try to get more into the logic of this, because I think that that's really interesting. And the Buddha did a good job of explicating that. So I think his rationale for why this is the case, why we suffer, is sort of based on his ontology, really, his fundamental understanding of the kind of nature of the universe, right? And what he recognized was that at base, ontologically, we live in a universe that is impermanent, imperfect, and empty of substance, okay? So he recognized, nothing is forever, right? He recognized nothing lasts forever. No phenomena endures endlessly, right? Everything is in a constant state of, kind of flux and transformation, right? And even the most robustly built things eventually fall, right? Even the great mountains of the Himalayas over time would eventually, be brought down, right? So he recognized this basic value of impermanence. And then, consistent with that, he had this idea of imperfection. We can never really attain a kind of perfect state. We might say perfect is a relative value. It's based on, our own assumptions of imperfection and perfection. It's sort of definitional. Your idea of perfect is going to be different than my idea of perfect. But even if we were to assume some sort of universal perfection, it's impossible. There's never a place where something could be perfect. Again, it's this kind of flux nature of reality. Things are always in a state of transformation. And then finally, he preached this emptiness, right? So he preached this idea that our universe is substanceless. It has no quality to it or no element which things are reducible to which cannot be reduced, right? So he wasn't a materialist. He didn't believe that, there was a sort of reducible element. And I know like in modern physics corroborates this. Like, I don't think that modern physics, we use atom theory because conventionally it helps us and it makes sense. But I think physicists have seen, oh yeah, if we keep reducing things, we can go further. We can go to subatomic particles. We can go further. Quantum physics has some sort of radical implications in the physics world, right? I think the Buddha was onto something in recognizing, yeah, there isn't really like a reducible a substance, to our experience, to our existence. And he would bring this thinking to our sense of self as well, right? So he would say, okay, we understand ourselves. We have a sense of self. We identify as a person. We tend to regard ourselves as having some substance or some sort of separate, ontologically distinct existence. But we ourselves have no essence either. There isn't a quality which we can be reduced to, which cannot be reduced. And so we'll talk about more when we talk about the Mahayana. But these form the basis of the basic logic of suffering, because he understood that despite these being the truth, we tend to look at life as having a kind of permanent quality. We tend to look at the world around us as kind of having permanence. We tend to see things as being perfectible, and we tend to regard ourselves and other things as having a kind of substance to them, as having an irreducible quality, as being solid in some way and not empty of true substance. And so he feels that this sort of disjunction is at the basis of our suffering. We live in a way that sort of psychologically is inconsistent with the reality around us. We tend to operate in a manner that's inconsistent with the truth. Yeah, and so he was really big on this idea of Tanha, on this idea of our tendency to sort of split off and project the conditions of happiness as somehow outside of ourselves and pursue them, to make, sort of a problem out of the conditions of our lives, to see happiness as out there. Let's think about how we operate in our day-to-day, right? I think that the basic logic that the Buddha is describing is something that all of us are impacted by, and all of us kind of operate under this logic every single day of our lives, right? Because first of all, we all experience some sense of fundamental dissatisfaction, I think, right? Whether consciously or unconsciously, it's there, right? I don't think, I'd be hard pressed to meet a person that's like, oh yeah, no, I'm truly happy. I'm truly happy, right? I don't think that that's the case. I think that most of us are subject to dukkha, to this sense of angst or dissatisfaction, right? But we can also think of more, kind of base or egregious examples, right? And just one of them I'm thinking about is like the career man, right? We could imagine, for instance, a person devoting all of his time and energy into his career. He was born and raised in a household that prioritized and, hard work and success and worldly success. And, he was raised by parents that really emphasized pursuing, material and occupational satisfaction, right? So we could imagine someone that might be, kind of possessed by this idea that, if I just work hard and if I just make a lot of money, I could be happy, right? I'm trying to just make the case for suffering. Like, I think the Buddha was just onto something. He was make the case for suffering. Like, is it really a stretch of logic to say that we suffer? I don't think so, right? No. The Buddha doesn't suffer because of the external conditions of our lives. That's often the trick that we play on ourselves, right? That it's the problem is out there, right? I just don't have this thing. I'm just not experiencing this right now. I'm just dealing with this situation, which is really, really difficult. And that's why I'm suffering. And if I could just get to a place where that's not happening anymore, or that's not going on, then I wouldn't suffer anymore, right?
If I could just have enough money, enough sex, enough.
100%, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, how often do we fall prey to that? I think all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're constantly sort of privileged one state over the other. And it's very difficult, I think, for us to relate to the here and now, to what we're experiencing right now, even when it's good, right? Yes. And so what the Buddha is getting at is that's not the right way of thinking. We can't think about our suffering as having an external quality. We have to think about our suffering as having a psychological basis. We have to look at the way that we're related to our experience, related to our life as the cause of suffering. And what he's saying is that it's not the things that we're experiencing, but it's sort of the attitudes, the fundamental beliefs we have about those things that cause the suffering, right?
Sounds very CBT.
It is very CBT in a way.
Yeah,
in a way. 100%, right? I think there's some subtle distinctions around that, but absolutely, right? Like, he is talking about a psychological and attitudinal relationship to our lives that engenders suffering, right?
So we have some distorted thinking.
Yeah. He might use the term illusion, right? I think what he's really talking about is best defined by the concept of samsara. So samsara, sort of conventionally and historically, is understood as the wheel of life and death. But I think how we would understand it in this context is he's talking about a cycle of suffering. So he's talking about this basis of, okay, so we sort of experience this dukkha. We're all holding this dukkha in some ways. We're all holding this sense of dissatisfaction with ourselves, with our lives. We experience this kind of fundamentally and unconsciously. And so we sort of project outwards conditions that might satisfy ourselves. We desire, we crave, right? We're bored with our lives, so we want to go on vacation. Or we don't like our jobs, so we want to get a new job. Or we don't like our spouse, so we want to get a new spouse. Or we don't like our kids, so we want to get new kids. Something, right? We find some problem in our life. And so then we envision a better way. We sort of fantasize. We desire, right? And I think that's tied up in Tana, is not just like the experience of a craving, but like the fantasy element of it as well, like the projecting element of it. And then we pursue that. We chase that. We find it, though, it never really satisfies us. It never really fits the bill. And that's because, again, there's something fundamentally illusory about this. The Buddha is sort of making the case that the logic at which we're basing our assumption of dissatisfaction is illusory, is problematic, is not real, right? And so this thing that we discover, it never really satisfies us. And so then we find something new to desire and new to pursue, and the cycle goes on and on and on.
Sounds like the cycle of addiction.
100%, right? I think that that's one of the ways that Buddhism becomes integrated into psychotherapy, is through the, kind of concepts in addiction. But I mean, other basic examples, and I was trying to describe earlier, again, we sort of imagine a career man. Maybe you're someone who sort of feels a sense of inferiority in your position at work, and you want to do more, so you pursue a better job, and you think, oh, if I could just get this job would make everything better, and I'd have more money, and I wouldn't feel so dissatisfied. And then you get that job, and lo and behold, you're not fully satisfied. There's some other problem that becomes made, and so on and so forth. And you never really get there. You never really arrive, right? So the Buddha's saying this is the kind of logic that's at play. We start with this fundamental dissatisfaction. That sort of seems built into the Buddhist model. That dissatisfaction, that's the first noble truth, right? Life is dukkha. Life is suffering. Life has this quality of dissatisfaction to it, and that's sort of what we're grappling with. And we sort of make a problem of that, and then we try to find a solution to that, and that perpetuates a cycle of suffering. We never really get to a sense of dissatisfaction.
So in other words, the fundamental problem is us thinking that suffering is occurring outside of ourselves, and also that we can relieve our suffering by finding some type of external solution.
That's right. That both the problem and solution are sort of out there. It's not a problem of our thinking. It's not a problem of the basic structure of our psychology. It's a real problem in our life that can be solved, right? I want to see if I can come up with a personal example. I feel less inclined to this now, although I think it still is the case. But like for me, it's about like body image. That's what really comes. That's one of the way that dukkha comes up for me. Is I sort of feel this fundamental dissatisfaction with my body image. I sort of feel like I'm not skinny enough, not ripped enough. And this was something that weighed heavily on me in my teen years and my 20s. And I pursued bodybuilding like pretty hard. I don't know that I ever got as aesthetic as some people out there, but I certainly made some gains, and I certainly was not satisfied with those gains. They were never enough, right? I fell into a cycle of samsara around that. And I mean, it got to a point where I was working out pretty intensely and doing kind of weird diet stuff and, extending myself pretty far. I was bound, though, by the logic of samsara. And I really believed that if I could just be ripped, that I would be happy.
Yes.
That it would somehow alleviate me of samsara.
You must have been pretty miserable cutting out all the carbs at some point.
Oh yeah, I was. Yeah. I did some intense diets. I also it was kind of fun actually to like bulk and try to get big and eat as much as I want. But okay, let's get back to theory here. So I think a lot of this can also be wrapped up in the concept of the ego. In Buddhism, that's one of the core concepts. Is we look at ego, right? Like ego is the site of this. The Buddhist ego is a little bit different than the psychoanalytic ego. So I think it's important to make a distinction for our psychoanalyst friends out there who have maybe not encountered this, or for anyone else who's interested. In Buddhism, the ego is really best defined as sort of the sufferer, or it best sort of encapsulates this cycle as our tendency to crave, attach, identify, to make a problem of things. When we talk about ego, we often talk about attachment, right? We talk about identifying. We talk about, I have a big ego about that. That sort of means that I'm really sort of stuck on it, right? Or another way of looking at egoic thinking is to look at it as selfish thinking, right?
Mm.
In Buddhism, the idea is that the ego sort of represents our separate sense of self. And so sort of fundamental to Buddhist thinking is this idea that our angst, our dissatisfaction comes from a sense of separation, that we feel we aren't everything else, that we don't belong to everything else, that we're kind of our own ontological entity.
Mm-hmm.
That we're discrete and sort of our own agent and sort of separate from other things, right? And I think this is what makes this sort of basic idea is what makes the logic of samsara compelling to us, is that as long as we feel like we're our own thing and sort of fundamentally lacking,
yes,
then it sort of propels us into this position that we have to seek our fullness in something, right? We have to go find it.
I must acquire as much as possible because I have a self, and in that selfishness, likely we might feel superior to others, or others are lower than us.
Yeah.
So even a lot of the problems in the world around consumerism, capitalism, global warming, these issues have been contributed to by the ego, would you say?
Yeah. Certainly our sense of separation, it propels us into sort of othering, for sure, right? Into a position of inferiority and superiority, into a position of conflict, like we don't recognize ourselves and other people.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the ways we navigate our angst or our dissatisfaction is to attribute it to other people.
Sure.
And so if they were just gone, then we would be so much happier, right? Yeah. But yeah, that sense of being separate, of being incomplete, I think, right, is sort of what is structuring the concept of the ego. The ego is sometimes called the small self, right? As opposed to the self with a big capital S, right? The big self in Buddhism. Again, it just sort of refers to this sense of separation and this tendency to seek wholeness through external means, right? Through our desire. And so again, distinct from the psychoanalytic ego, which by kind of Freud's definition was just a sort of a space of balancing and working out the conflicts of our kind of our base instincts with the internalized expectations of our culture, right? You could argue that the psychoanalytic id is more the Buddhist ego, right? Like our base desire, stems from our id.
Makes sense.
Okay, and so then I've described samsara. And so that the other thing I'll just say is that the Buddha also had a concept, which was karma. He believed that things were conditioned. He believed that, and he understood that there was a kind of cause and effect to things, right? Such that if you did something, it would sort of correspond and follow from that. And so this was the karma is sort of the logic of samsara, or it's sort of the force that propels samsara, right? There's kind of a carrying forward. It's what makes the motion of samsara happen, right? We seek satisfaction from our dissatisfaction. And in our efforts to do that, we actually create more dissatisfaction. We create the conditions of our dissatisfaction through the pursuit of satisfaction. And, just as an example, using the cycle of addiction, which was really great, Richard, we feel our fundamental sense of satisfaction. We crave and desire drugs. We go and use drugs. We feel ashamed, or maybe we do something shameful to use those drugs.
Yes.
And now we're in a position where we're feeling even more dissatisfied. And that's what propels. And so it's like, he's really saying that, our actions have consequences, that we can sort of create conditions with actions, and we can be conditioned as well. We can kind of suffer conditions which bring about this. And so that's what karma means. It's a little bit different than, getting what you give. Although there's something in that, right? Of like, if we can break the cycle of samsara, if we can operate in a way that doesn't sort of operate on this fundamental sense of dissatisfaction and desire, then maybe we can be in a situation where we're less likely for our dissatisfaction to arise, or less likely to be kind of trapped in the cycle of samsara. It can lose some of its energy.
It sounds like, and I'm sure this will be discussed later, that Buddhism allows for free will. I've always gotten the impression, and maybe some listeners have had that impression too, that, and in some, maybe perhaps this is specific to some countries, that there's a fatalist kind of element of Buddhism with some understandings of it, that we're trapped in the cycle of suffering, and there's kind of, no way out, right? It's a very abstract of any way out, right? Like, okay, even if I do all of this good stuff, maybe I'm not going to even know whether I am going to turn into a cockroach or a butterfly or a human in my next cycle, right? How do I know if I'm even good enough, so to speak?
Right. Yeah, I think Buddhist ontology is more complex than the kind of dichotomy of free will and determinism allows. And that's emblematic of its non-dual sort of logic, its dialectic logic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that the Buddha would say, yeah, we have free will, because I don't think that the Buddha would assume that we're independent agents that can operate from a place of our own freedom. I think also you're right. The Buddha is not saying, yeah, we're completely bound and determined by the conditions around us. We can never be free. We're always going to be subject to this cycle of dissatisfaction and desire.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha wasn't saying that either, or else what would be the point? What would be the point of practicing any of this, right? He was speaking of a kind of freedom, certainly. He was speaking of a freedom from the cycle of samsara. I think we've got to be distinct about this. The cycle of samsara is not everything. It's just something distinct. It's not all of our actions. It's not all of us. It's just the way that we operate. It's just it's a fundamental way that we operate, but it is not the totality of who we are.
Yes.
It's a sort of, it's a thing we're stuck in, and it's predicated on a kind of very subtle unconscious logic, which operates in all of us. We're going to talk about, where that might come from, right? And actually, I think Buddhism doesn't do a very good job of explaining that, but that's not all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there is more to us than just this. And I think that that's sort of a little bit of what the Buddha is getting at, is like who we are is not reducible to samsara, right? It's not reducible to this cycle of dissatisfaction and desire.
In a sense, and it makes sense that so many people are, or psychology is adopting Buddhism more, though, of course, sometimes in a very limited way, but in a more advanced way, I see Buddha perhaps as one of the early systems thinkers of this idea that you could exert influence on others in your situation and yourself, and others exert influence on you. So it's not that that's very different than I control others and I try to produce this guaranteed outcome.
Yeah.
But I am the product of influences on me, right? My family influences, my cultural influences, perhaps ideas around reincarnation, past lives, etc., that all have an influence. But also there is hope that I can influence myself and others towards a more enlightened way of life.
You're forcing my hand into Buddhist ontology, Richard. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, because I think what you're saying is really important. And you're right. The Buddha does speak to a kind of systems theory. He recognizes that we tend to identify ourselves as kind of a discrete, separate element, which is not defined, is not substantive of our relationship to everything else, right? We tend to just say, oh no, I'm me. This is who I am. I'm Glenn. I'm a counselor.
I'm a self-made man.
Yeah, that's right. And if I have problems, they're my fault or not, or they're not my fault at all. An example of the logic I sort of got into in my 20s was like, I really started playing with this idea, and I really started thinking about, okay, well, who am I, right? Who am I? And if I really start to look at that, where does that take me, right? And it was sort of like, it was really hard it was impossible, in fact, to discover an element that I could say was me that was not somehow connected to something else, right? So if I say I'm a counselor, okay, well, yes, I'm a counselor, but that's just my occupation. That doesn't really describe me essentially, right? And well, if I say I'm a man, okay, well, sure, that describes my gender identity, but like, what does that say about me, right? It actually doesn't really say anything. Like there's a lot of men in the world, it doesn't actually make me special or unique, right? I really searched, right? And it's like, I couldn't find, but what I could find was like a lot of the elements that I would use to define myself were somehow related to other things, right? So if I said, okay, well, I'm my parents' kids, okay, well then sure, that's true of me. But then I'm sort of, in some ways, then my parents are my identity, right? In some ways, I wouldn't be me if it wasn't for them, right? I have to attribute something of who I am or myself then to them. And that's not really me. So that's not a discrete element, but it's a relational element. And that's sort of what you're talking about is, yeah, when we start to look at, ourselves or who we are, when we start to unpack, our identity a little bit and our reality, if we start to do what the Buddha suggests we do and really investigate these things, we will not and we cannot find a sense of separateness. The Buddha had an image. I don't think it was the Buddha himself that described this image. I think it was somewhere later down the line in Buddhist kind of theology, but an image to describe the ontology of Buddhism. And it's called Indra's jeweled gnat. I really like it. I think it's a great description. So rather than thinking about things as, kind of sort of separate, discrete elements, like, okay, there's Richard, here's me, here's my computer, here's my microphone, and these are all kind of their own things, and they don't have any bearing on anything else, and they're their own discrete elements. We would say, okay, everything is like a jewel in a giant net of jewels that are all connected. And if we go to any of the jewels and we start to look at what that jewel is, what we discover is that the jewel is actually just a reflection of all of the other jewels in the net. And that we can't actually describe any jewel independent of the net, because the true nature of every jewel is the reflection of all jewels. If those jewels didn't exist, neither would this jewel. They're all kind of mutually interdependent. And that's the language that's often used. So that's what the Buddha was getting at. So I think your systems theory is good. I wonder if systems theory goes far enough, though, because the Buddha is really saying without the system, in some ways, there would be no individual entity. But he's also saying without individual entities, there would be no system. So he's kind of, the logic can go both ways. And that's important. That's an important component of the non-dual logic of Mahayana Buddhism.
Yeah, it moves away from reductionism and separation and othering.
That's right. That's right. We can't take that position in Buddhism. That is not a position in Buddhism. That would be sort of an anti-Buddhist position. But I would say it's the samsaric position, and it's the position that unfortunately we all fall prey to. I think you can work very hard at this, and that it still operates. The language of samsara, or the logic of samsara, is pernicious and deep, runs deep. There's a couple more things I want to say about basic Buddhism, and then we can keep talking about this, because this is what you're talking about right now. On the kind of ontology is really important as we talk more about integration, especially. Okay. But a couple more things I want to say. The Buddha made some prescriptive practices. The Buddha did not just describe a kind of philosophy. He did not just make the case for this logic. He was big on the experiential. And so he prescribed a practice of meditation. In a basic sense, actually, two practices of meditation. He described shamatha meditation and vipassana meditation. And shamatha is sort of what's called calm abiding meditation. It's a preparatory meditation practice. It's meant to calm the mind. So the whole purpose of shamatha meditation is just meant to calm the mind, to stop it from running so fast, to stop our minds from racing the way that they do, to be able to practice right concentration and right mindfulness. And then vipassana meditation is the mindfulness meditation that we understand kind of contemporarily. And for the Buddha, this was the meditation that would propel us into the insight of our true nature. So the Buddha prescribed this as the method, this sitting meditation practice as the method of discovering what he was talking about and working with what he was talking about. So the implications of that will be important when we discuss mindfulness integration. But should I break down mindfulness now? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions around mindfulness, so that might be helpful.
Sure, yeah. I think because we're going to be talking about it so much, it's important to define. Mindfulness meditation is the practice of meditation that involves holding an experience in oneself non-judgmentally and with acceptance, and with a sort of gentle, compassionate attention. So consistent with the logic of samsara, the Buddha understood that we have a tendency to rejection, to self-rejection, that consistent with our dissatisfaction, we often make a problem of our own experience, right? Think about the example I gave earlier of me wanting to be a super ripjack guy. I would make a problem of my cravings for junk food, or I would make a problem with my exhaustion about not wanting to go to the gym, right? This was inconsistent with my desire. And so mindfulness meditation is meant as sort of an antidote to this in some ways, I think. Prescriptively, it's meant to encourage us to open to our experience. Experience that we or disavow in the interest of our desire. And yes, so it involves very little. It involves just experiencing what you're experiencing and just holding that in your experience and sitting with it mindfully. There's very little to the practice. It just involves paying attention to what you're experiencing, doing your best not to judge it, not to say it's good, not to say it's bad, not to project a meaning onto it, getting curious about it, seeing what it is, right? Trying to discover what you're actually experiencing. And so we'll talk more about the implications of that in a bit, okay? I want to get into the distinction between the schools of thought in Buddhism, because that is super important as we talk about integration, okay? Because Buddhism has different schools of thought in it, and they're fundamentally different. They operate on a different logic. Okay. These schools of thought are sometimes called the vehicles, literally the way in which we travel forward or move forward, right? And the two that I'm going to be talking about are the Hinayana and the Mahayana. There is another vehicle. There's another school of thought associated with the Tibetan school. It's called the Vajrayana. I'm not going to talk about that because it's an esoteric school of thought, and I'm not initiated in it. And I could not do it justice. I've read books on Vajrayana. I technically took refuge under a Vajrayana guru, but I haven't actually really been initiated in the practices. I don't think it's right to talk about them. But I'll talk about the Hinayana and Mahayana because that's more kind of out there and available, and the distinction is important. So the Hinayana school of Buddhism is connected with these sort of prescriptive preliminary teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path. There's a collection of his teachings called the Pali Canon because they were originally in the Pali language. There's one of the more keystone teachings around that is called the Dhammapada, which is kind of like a basic set of teachings by the Buddha on suffering and the logic of suffering. The Hinayana is called the lesser vehicle. The Hinayana teachings emphasize following the Noble Eightfold Path, and they emphasize the accumulation of merit. So one of the preliminary sort of teachings that the Buddha gave was basically on like, do this, don't do this, follow the Eightfold Path, don't kill, don't lie, don't be a bad guy, practice mindfulness, be nice to other people, try not to be a super attached person, try not to follow the object of your desire into disaster, right? It was a very kind of basic, some people say it's in some ways it's kind of described for lay people. It was meant for lay people. It was teachings meant to make Buddhism as accessible as possible. But there is this sort of idea in the Hinayana, embedded in the Hinayana, that's sort of like, okay, I'm not enlightened. I'm subject to samsara. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a mess. And the Noble Path is going to straighten me out. So if I just practice the Noble Path and get really good at it, then I'll get enlightened, right? And so it sort of starts from this place of non-enlightenment. It starts from this place of, I don't have it, but if I just do these things, I will get it.
I only go to 30 meetings in 30 days at 12-step.
I don't get that. What do you mean by that?
So it strikes me as similar to sometimes the thinking of a person who's coming out of addiction and into recovery.
Right.
And there is a lot of structure,
yes,
and a lot of rules,
yes,
often needed by the person who is feeling very groundless.
Yes.
That is often found in structures such as AA, 12-step, religion. There's obviously non-religious structures as well, but
I think that's a great distinction, Richard, or a great example. I love that. That would be I think a good parallel for the Hinayana, right? Yeah. We're totally embedded in our suffering. We're totally embedded in this kind of our dissatisfaction and desire. We have no concept of logic outside of that. And then we sort of discover that. And so, yeah, there's a real prescriptive kind of narrow path for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, here's what we need to do. And that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And we would say it's sort of missing a key or important element of the Buddhist teachings, that it emphasizes the wrong thing. It emphasizes merit, which merit can in some way be an object of desire, because merit in some way has an implied split in it, right? And it has an implied we're not good enough and we need to get better.
Yes.
Right.
If only I can do enough good actions.
That's right. That's right.
This will outweigh the bad and I'll move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these teachings contain, in some ways, they still follow the logic of samsara. Yes. I think that's important in some ways, because I think that when you're speaking to someone who's totally ignorant to all of this, if you were to just say, no, you're fine. Mm-hmm. There's no problem at all. In fact, it's just that you have this belief that you're separate from all things, and you're actually not. There's actually no problem.
Yeah, they'll be
your
like,
dissatisfaction
what?
is illusion. They'd be like, what? Yeah. It wouldn't make sense to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the challenges is that this is a way that a lot of people relate to Buddhism and the teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah.
This is not like, people don't always get to the Mahayana. The Mahayana is not always expressed. I in kind of researching this episode, I was looking at other people in popular media talking about Buddhism and psychotherapy. A lot of them related to Buddhism in this way. Oh yeah, Buddhism is sort of a path to the best life ever.
Yes.
Or yeah, and I'm really just focused on practicing meditation. I'm trying to get better at it, right? I want to be good at meditating.
Yeah.
Because if I'm good at meditating, then I won't suffer my desire anymore.
Or even, and it sounds very noble, but I know Watts talks about it in Psychotherapy East and West, that I want to be a good person. I want to do all of these compassionate acts towards others
Yeah.
or for others. But again, we can get trapped in this accumulation, I guess, of good acts and actually not be so enlightened, right? And then not really do Buddhism or the world, the justice it deserves.
This can perpetuate samsara
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, right? Because we
Yeah.
get focused on discovering external conditions still
Yes.
that will satisfy our desire.
Yes, we're not looking on the inward.
That's right. And desire in this case is really subtle. I don't think that this always operates in this sort of grandiose or explicit way. I need to be the best Buddha ever.
No.
It might just operate in this very discrete, nuanced dissatisfaction when practicing meditation, for instance.
Yes.
Or yeah, it might operate in the way that we think about charity. Oh, I need to give because the Buddha told me I should give and it's good to give. And I'm being told that compassion is the right thing to do.
And why don't I feel better now after I have done all of these?
Yeah, maybe I didn't give
actions?
enough. Maybe I need to give more. Yeah,
I see exactly what you mean. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it doesn't quite solve the problem in some ways. And for that, we need to go to the Mahayana. We need to go to the greater vehicle, which I like to think of as Buddhism's radical underbelly.
Buddhism's Ferrari.
Yeah. The Mahayana is based on two teachings that were, I guess, sort of discovered or were brought out later in Buddhist history. They're not associated with the Pali Canon, so they're separate from them. I think the first instances of them were actually discovered in China, but they're attributed to the Buddha. So they're still said to be the Buddha's words, to be descriptions of the Buddha's teachings and his kind of sutras, his lecture. But they're called the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra. Mahayana Buddhism, these sutras, they're really emphasizing realization of one's true nature over the accumulation of merit. They're really emphasizing, kind of appreciating, really experientially understanding this impermanence, this groundlessness, this essenceless, this non-duality that we operate in. Merit becomes like a problematic concept that sort of entrenches us in dualist. There's an I. We can be good, we can be bad, we can be better, we can be worse. It's not that being good is enlightened anymore. I want to give an example from Mahayana Buddhism. Actually, I'll tell a quick story of Bodhidharma. So in Zen Buddhism, at least, there's this idea of a patriarchal lineage that extends from the Buddha to whoever the current patriarch of Zen Buddhism is. And so the Zen, probably as a function of Japanese society, but the Zen Buddhists were interested in kind of tracking a lineage of the transmission of the Buddha's teachings to the contemporary era. And there would be a kind of patriarch who would be entrusted, kind of like the Buddhist Pope, for Zen Buddhism in some way, this sort of patriarch, right? And so the first 6 patriarchs were Indian because they were all connected to the original Buddhist lineage. And the 6th of them was Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma was an Indian man and practitioner of Buddhism who had the sort of light of enlightenment transmitted to him by his teacher. And he made the decision to move west, to go west into China and to bring Buddhism to China. And so he did this. He went and he sort of brought the Buddhist teachings to China. And this was, people loved. They loved Bodhidharma. They loved the teachings of the Buddha. Fun fact, Bodhidharma is associated with the Shaolin Temple and Shaolin martial arts. I sure hope it was. I sure hope I'm not spreading some false fact, but I'm fairly certain that Bodhidharma is associated with Shaolin Kung Fu. I don't know if he practiced it, but like the Shaolin Temple, at least. Yeah, and Shaolin Buddhism. So anyway, he was kind of essential in spreading Buddhism to China. And there's a story of like the Emperor of China meeting with Bodhidharma, which was like a big deal. Bodhidharma was recognized as this opponent of Buddhism, this awesome guy. And the Emperor of China was very pro-Buddhist, so he had done a lot in the interest of Buddhism. And he brought Bodhidharma to his palace and he sort of told him this. He said, look, Bodhidharma, I've built so many temples to Buddha, across China. Like, look at how invested I am in Buddhism. Look how much I've done to advance Buddhism in this country. Aren't I so great? Like, have I not accumulated so much merit? And Bodhidharma, was sort of like looking at the emperor and he was like, you just don't get it. Like, you really just don't get what Buddhism is all about. And he was very dissatisfied with this conversation. He was very troubled by it. And this propelled him to go and sit in a cave for, I think, a decade and stare at a wall. Yeah. And meditate and really embed himself in spiritual practice in a cave. And Bodhidharma's enlightenment was said to come when a child discovered him, or a couple of kids discovered him in the cave, and they freaked out. They thought he was a monster because he was all bearded and Indian, and it was kind of scary to them. And they threw a rock at his head, and when the rock hit his head, that was his moment of enlightenment. But I like that story because it illustrates the fundamental point, which is Bodhidharma recognized this merit didn't matter, right? This accumulation of merit was not important. What was important was really realizing what the Buddha was talking about in his basic ontological, kind of conception that things are impermanent, that our existence is groundless, essenceless, that our separate self doesn't exist. And so the Mahayana Buddhism is associated with Zen, with Chinese Chan meditation, with Korean Zen. There's a different emphasis. The practices are less on practices that cultivate merit, or that, like you said, that are kind of like guardrails that kind of get you into thinking in a different way. And they're more about penetrating through the illusion of the ego. And so one of the popular practices in Zen Buddhism is the koan, is to give a student a solutionless problem, right? A sort of logically paradoxical, sort of story or problem or riddle, and to have them mull it over. The idea being that, this is something that our desire might try to make a problem of, that we can discover a solution to, but we will never be able to discover a solution to it. It becomes sort of something that our desire can operate on that we cannot actually become satisfied by, even temporarily, right? And the hope is that eventually it will lead us to appreciating the fruitlessness of that endeavor, and to seeing that we can't possibly find the satisfaction that our desire suggests, and to see that even the endeavor itself is folly and illusion. So there you go. I'm espousing the secrets of Buddhism already. So that's Buddhism in a nutshell, Richard. There you go. It's my Buddhist 101 lecture. I hope that helps our listeners. I hope that makes sense. I hope that we were able to articulate something of Buddhist philosophy in a way that is accessible. I hope it's not confusing. It's challenging for me, I think, to try to say this, because I want to try to honor the logic of the Mahayana. I want to try to honor what the Buddha was getting at. And just sort of conventional language doesn't always allow that. And we're also talking about something outside of our conventional logic. When we talk about, I remember being a teenager. I remember getting into Buddhism, and I remember going to one of my friends and talking about meditation. And she just sort of went, "Why do you do that? Like, I don't get why you do that. Like, what good is it to sit in a room and not do anything? Like, what?" And she was a Christian, so for her, meditation was associated with staring at a candle. So she would say, "I don't get how it helps you to sit and stare at a candle," which I wasn't doing anyway. But she, it was like, it goes against our conventional logic. We tend to think in a way that we tend to have a self-consciousness. We tend to think in a way that follows the logic of samsara. And so
we got to be productive.
Yeah, that's right. And so sometimes I don't want to sort of fall prey to what sometimes happens, which is talking about Buddhism within the logic of samsara, kind of like in the Hinayana, talking about Buddhism as a way of accumulating merit. Look how good we are. We're good Buddhists. We practice compassion. We practice meditation. We say our mantras, and we go and we try to be selfless people and not operate on our desire. There's more to this, and there's a subversive non-dual element to this. Some of this is captured by a Zen Mondo. If you see the Buddha on the road, kill him, which I always like that, because I think it just gets to the heart of this so well in some ways. In Mahayana Buddhism, they really understood it, that we can't assume that the orthodox practices, the institutions associated with Buddhism, are really what the Buddha was getting at. He was not suggesting we go and make a religion out of his teachings. He was not suggesting that we go and operate as little good Buddhas and follow his precepts and live according to a prescribed code of ethics. And so if they were really saying that his philosophy is about this essenceless, this non-duality. And so if you see the Buddha, you're not seeing the Buddha. There is no Buddha. The Buddha isn't an entity, right? The Buddha, just like the rest of us, has no true nature, no true self. So it can't be the Buddha. So kill him. Yeah. So why don't we break for part 2? We'll come back with a second part to this episode where we talk more about integration. Now that we've laid the foundation of Buddhist philosophy, we'll really look at its integration into psychotherapy.
Great. Looking forward to it.
All right.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.